turn back to Psalm 73, please. Not Psalm 73, Psalm 141. There was a reason I said 73. Psalm 141, just keeping myself on my toes. A little moment of panic there. Now, the reason I said 73 is because 73 of the Psalms, which is nearly half of the entire collection, are attributed to David, including this one. But while some of them have titles that connect to events in David's life, most of them don't. And Psalm 141 fits into that latter category. We have no idea really what specifically was happening in David's life to cause him to write this psalm. So perhaps we can speculate, but we don't know for sure. But this psalm is a companion to the one immediately before it. You don't have to turn to it, but there are similar themes in Psalm 140. And both of these psalms have a clear and familiar theme to us. David, as he so often was, is in distress. He's going through trial, and he cries out in his distress to God to help him. But the striking thing that drew me to this particular psalm is that David shows himself to be a man with an unusual, keen self-awareness. He doesn't just pray for deliverance from evil men. He prays for deliverance from himself, from his own sinful heart. And even if we perhaps don't feel that we are currently being assailed by wicked people, I'm sure we all know the sin that lurks in our own hearts. So I trust that we can empathize and identify with this psalm and be helped tonight. Now, the meat of the psalm is in the middle section, from verses 3 to 7, and that's I would call the intriguing bit that perhaps we're naturally drawn to. And yet, in a sense, the most important parts of this psalm are the bookends at the beginning and the end, because this is a psalm that begins and ends with the covenant God, with David looking upwards, recognizing his need of the Lord, crying out to the Lord, trusting in the Lord, depending on the Lord. And that's where we want to begin and end tonight. And this is how we're going to take it. We'll look at part 1, which is this urgent cry of David's. Then we'll look at verses 3 to 7, which is the nub of the problem, David's issue and what's going on. And then we finally end up with verses 8 to 10 and David's trust in the Lord. So let's start with how David starts. Verse 1, O Lord, I call to you, come quickly to me. Hear my voice when I call to you. Now, at this point, we don't know what the problem is. All we know is that it's urgent. It's almost too urgent for him to outline in detail. And David pleads that urgency. He's looking to the Lord to do something and to do it quickly. And I know that we often talk, don't we, about the Lord's timing and waiting for the Lord. And yet David shows us here that the urgent SOS prayer is a legitimate prayer. There are times when our need is immediate, and it is right to cry out to the Lord and to seek his very swift help. Now, you get a sense of this, I think, in the timing of the prayer. It would seem that it's evening, when, of course, the light is fading, nighttime is drawing near, and evil people love the darkness as a cloak for their wickedness. And David perhaps recognizes better than most that a godly man is never going to be more vulnerable than when he's about to lay his head on the pillow at night. And yet this urgency doesn't mean that David isn't bothered about the Lord. The problem doesn't drive out the object of the prayer, if you know what I mean. Verse 2, may my prayer be set before you like incense. May the lifting up of my hands be like the evening sacrifice. So if, as I think, David is praying in the evening, he's remembering the rhythm of worship, the daily sacrifices that would have been made in the tabernacle every morning and every evening. And as he thinks of this and as he prays, he's praying that just as the sweet smell or smoke of the incense would rise upwards, so his prayer will be a pleasing aroma to God. In other words, what David is wanting is that his prayer will be a true prayer, a prayer of faith, a prayer of an undivided heart, an act of worship. Yes, it's an emergency SOS prayer. Yes, his need is urgent, and if it is in the evening, he's probably growing tired. But that doesn't mean that David is going to approach God casually or sloppily, because David reverences God, and he wants his prayer to be an act of worship, because, of course, that is what true prayer is. Prayer is not soliciting God for requests or sort of dropping off a shopping list of things we need at his throne. Prayer is an act of humility. It's an expression of our dependence upon God. It's the act of people who know their place before the Creator. And this is why David symbolically raises his hands, because it's a symbol of his dependence on God. That's worship, or we might say worthship. It's declaring the worth of God. It's glorifying him. And it's what we do when we really pray, with our hearts and our heads, even if it's an SOS emergency prayer. And this kind of act of worship, this sincere prayer, this act of dependency upon God, pleases God. It is like the sweet smell of incense. Revelation 5 verse 8 talks about this from the heavenly perspective. It speaks of the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders holding golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And that's David's prayer. He is a true worshipper. And it's no wonder that after the return of the Jews from exile in Babylon, this psalm tended to be used as an evening prayer. This reverent act of humble dependence upon the Lord. This prayer that is a pleasing aroma to him. Now, perhaps so far so straightforward, but it does beg the question, what has precipitated this prayer? What is the problem? Which moves us into the second section, the meat of this psalm, verses 3 to 7. And the short answer to the question, well, what's precipitated it, is we don't know. It's not entirely clear what's happened, so we have to try and read between the lines a little bit. But let's have a look at verses 3 and 4. David says, "Set a guard over my mouth, O Lord. Keep watch over the door of my lips. Let not my heart be drawn to what is evil, to take part in wicked deeds with men who are evil doers. Let me not eat of their delicacies." Now, David is coming under tremendous pressure from evil people. And they're not just any evil people. They are clearly men of influence and standing who are attractive to David. And apparently the English translation in verse 4, in the Hebrew word used for men who do evil, who are evildoers, it refers to people with land and with rank and with status. So in other words, we're thinking here about the aristocracy, the elite, the rich and the powerful of Israelite society. For all their privilege, they're evil, they're godless. They use their privilege to indulge their fleshly appetites and advance their evil ambitions. And David finds himself the subject of their attention, which isn't really surprising, because David was a man of great gift and great capacity. And elite people of influence would naturally see David strategically. See him as someone who was worth knowing, someone who they could use. Now, some people have speculated that this may have been when David was a young man in King Saul's court, at a time when his star is in the ascendancy and King Saul's is in decline. And perhaps the nobility, sensing this shift in power dynamics, are exerting all their influence to ensnare David, to try and bring him into their confidence and to form some kind of alliance with him. Now, we don't know, so I wouldn't want to take it any further than that. It's speculation. But whatever the scenario is, clearly David's in danger, because big men with big plans and the ability to implement those plans, well, that's hard enough. That's impressive. And it's even harder when they're interested in you. It's very gratifying, isn't it? But I think the most striking thing is that David finds himself drawn to them. And we might think, well, David is the man after God's own heart. David would shun them completely. Not so. Remember what Jeremiah 17:9 says. It says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. It's a tricky thing. And David knows his own heart. He's a self-aware man. One commentator puts it like this: David is not too good for evil people. He's too much like them, and therefore likely to be swept away by their wickedness if in their company. This is what David is speaking about when he says, "Let me not eat of their delicacies." Now, it's a reference to the meal table, but in ancient times, sharing a meal was a much more serious and sacred thing than it perhaps is today. And it went far beyond just sort of casual socializing. This is about fellowship. It's about sharing of values. It's about consenting to evil. This is about loyalty to truth and to righteousness being swapped and consenting to wickedness. Now, in his book, the Screwtape Letters, this is how C.S. Lewis describes the danger. There is a subtle play of looks and tones and laughs by which a mortal can imply that he is of the same party as those to whom he is speaking. He will assume at first only by his manner, but presently by his words, all sorts of cynical and sceptical attitudes which are not really his, but they may become his. All mortals tend to turn into the thing they are pretending to be. Now, I think we all know what he's talking about. Impressive people of standing and status and intelligence and wit. Perhaps they've invited us to spend an evening with them or to go on a long weekend with them, and it's very gratifying to have been asked, and they clearly want our company, and it makes us feel good, and we spend time with them, and it's warm and it's cozy and it's comfortable, and the food and drink are good, and the conversation is stimulating. But as time progresses, opinions are espoused and positions are advanced that are clearly anti-God, and we know that. And yet we don't feel it's quite the right time or place to oppose them, so we sort of go along with it. And the longer we go along with it, the greater the temptation just to go with the flow, to laugh at jokes that we don't really find funny, to agree with positions that are entirely opposed to our faith. And in the end, we are consenting to wickedness. And this is why David doesn't immediately say, "Lord, smite those evil men." Rather, he prays for himself. "Set a guard over my mouth, O Lord. Keep watch over the door of my lips." Now, it's very clear from the Bible that how we speak is an indicator of our spiritual maturity or lack of. Proverbs 13:3 says that he who guards his lips guards his life, but he who speaks rashly will come to ruin. And just as the tabernacle, the house of God, required guards and doorkeepers, so the man or woman of God needs his mouth to be guarded and to be kept. And we do, don't we? I know I'm guilty of this often, of saying things I shouldn't say or carelessly. I think we all need to consider, don't we, how we speak. Because, often it's not our actions that draw attention, it's our words. Foolish jokes, uncensored opinions, hasty or silly speculations, heated criticisms. These are the things that the enemy can pick up on to sow discord within the church and also to cause dishonour to God outside the church. And I think this is especially true, isn't it, in the age of social media, where something you may have said online years and years ago can be held against you. Now, of course, our words are not spoken in a vacuum, are they? They come from our hearts. What's inside always comes out in the end. And that's why David says, "Let not my heart be drawn to what is evil." It says in Proverbs 4, "Above all else, guard your heart, for it is the wellspring of life." As Jeremiah says, our hearts are deceptive. They're tricky things. They're complicated, aren't they? I think this is something that the great Christians of old and the great saints of old, like David, instinctively knew, that the greatest enemy lurks within. You see, I think when we first become Christians, we often tend to look up to older saints and we idolize these spiritual heroes of the past, and we think, wouldn't it be wonderful one day if I kind of advanced on the Christian path to that point, to be as godly as they are. And we perhaps imagine naively that these people, while not perfect, are are close to it. And perhaps that, they must enjoy this serene inner peace and communion with the Lord every day. And I think the truth is that Christian maturity is to know your own heart. It is to know the depths of the sin that lurks within. And therefore, the truth is that for the greatest heroes of faith, the further they advanced with the Lord, the more sinful they felt, the more inner anguish they knew. And this is true with David. His life didn't get easier as he got older. He was self-suspicious, and he knew that he was being drawn to evil. Now, of course, that's only half the battle, isn't it? Knowing it isn't enough. We've got to guard our own hearts. And of course, the trouble is that we're often not as vigilant as we would like. Sometimes we're weak and we're tired and we're compromised, and perhaps we don't even see the danger till it's too late. We need someone greater than ourselves. And what David knew, I think we know. That where we fail, God doesn't fail. Psalm 121, he will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. And 1 John 3 reminds us, he is greater than our hearts, and he knows everything. So God's surveillance of our hearts is ceaseless, and it's loving, and it's perfect. There might be an internet outage, but God's surveillance never stops. And of course, God guards our hearts in a variety of ways, doesn't he? He does so through his Holy Spirit, speaking through our conscience, through his word applied to our hearts, but also, interestingly, he guards us through other believers. David acknowledges this, doesn't he, in verse 5? Let a righteous man strike me. It's a kindness. Let him rebuke me. It is oil on my head. My head will not refuse it. So, surrounded by the flattery and the commendation of wicked men who stroke his ego and indulge his sinful instincts, David would far, far prefer hard truth from a person of integrity. Someone who knows him, someone who cares about him. The wounds of a friend, Proverbs 27 speaks of it. Wounds from a friend can be trusted, but an enemy multiplies kisses. The Lord uses godly people to hold us to account, to speak truth to us. Remember Nathan. Nathan the prophet risked his life, his reputation, his friendship with David to tell David a hard truth, God's truth. And later, repentant David, in his right mind, respected Nathan for it. But it was very hard at the time. Now, I'm not advocating that friends are forever pointing out faults to each other. That would be pretty dismal, wouldn't it? And we do know that love covers over a multitude of sins. But there are times when it is necessary, and a true friend is not someone who agrees with you all the time. They may agree with you most of the time, but a true friend who truly loves you and has your best interests at heart will dare to tell you the truth. And we need to hear the truth, because our hearts are deceitful and we can deceive ourselves. C.H. Spurgeon puts it like this: depend upon it, the man who will tell you your faults is your best friend. It may not be a pleasant thing for him to do it, and he knows that he's running the risk of losing your friendship, but he is a true and sincere friend. Therefore, thank him for his reproof and learn how you may improve by what he tells you. That person is like oil on the head, which was the ancient symbol of honour. They're not only your true friend, they are God's means of grace to you, to help guard your heart, to keep you from danger. And I think this is why, one of many reasons why God puts us in churches. What you tend to find is that Christians who stay away from church and just focus on their own walk with the Lord, on the internet, at home, tend to fall into all sorts of quite serious, strange doctrinal errors, because they haven't got friends who are speaking truth to them. They're not guarding their own hearts, and we need each other, don't we? We need to have honest, accountable relationships with each other. Now, for everything that we've just considered, David is now going to pray about the wicked. Yes, he knows, he takes responsibility for his own sin, And yes, he knows that he needs all the help he can get. He needs righteous people to help him. But the elephant in the room, what of these wicked people? And that's where the second half of verse 5 through to verse 7 comes in. Now, these verses are, I'm told, extremely difficult. They may not appear so in the English, but I'm told that the Hebrew is very obscure and scholars are not certain how to translate them. And if they aren't sure, given I'm not a Hebrew scholar, well, I have no chance. But I think the basic sense of them is quite clear, that David prays for God's judgment to be brought to bear upon the wicked. Now, David's not being vindictive, but he sees that these people are opposing him or seeking to twist him and use him for their own ends because they oppose God. They are God's enemies first and foremost. And David is always concerned for God's honour, not his own. He's concerned that God's purposes in the world will suffer and that God's name will be brought into disrepute by these wicked men harnessing David's gifts and using him to their own ends. And it's with this in mind that David prays in verse 7 that as the farmer breaks up the soil, brings up the rocks, so the bones of these evil people will be scattered without ceremony, without any burial. And verse 6 he says, My prayer is ever against the deeds of evildoers. Their rulers will be thrown down from the cliffs, and the wicked will learn that my words were well spoken. In other words, God will bring a severe judgment upon these wicked men, David prays. And the shock of the death of these influential, rich, powerful people will really jolt the supporters of these men. That people who were once swayed by these powerful people will suddenly stop short and they'll remember David and David's life and David's prayer. They will learn that David's words were well spoken, which is an ancient equivalent of, I told you so. Now, I'm not saying that ordinarily we would pray this kind of prayer. As we know, David held a unique position in salvation history. He was God's anointed king, the Messiah, with a small m. And yet I do think there is a sense in which gospel preaching has that same prophetic function. It faithfully proclaims God's truth and God's standards to a world that won't have it. And so when judgment inevitably comes from the Lord, so does vindication for the preacher and also for the message, and indeed for all of God's church, people living according to God's truth. There will be, in the end, a divine, I told you so. And we should desire that. Now, as much as we desire friends and loved ones to be saved, of course we do. We're not there praying for judgment all the time. We should also desire that God's truth and justice prevails, and it will do. So in a sense, we should desire a divine, I told you so. Not that David is obsessed here with his own vindication. He's not. And although he's praying against the deeds of evildoers, that's not the focus of this psalm, is it? And the focus isn't even on himself. He is concerned about himself. But David's ultimate primary focus is on the Lord, which leads us to this third and final section, these final 3 verses. We've already seen, haven't we, that David was focused upon the Lord from the get-go. Verse 2, he was so concerned that his emergency SOS prayer to the Lord would be like incense, pleasing, an act of worship from his heart. His focus isn't the danger, it's not his own vindication, it's his relationship with the Lord. And that's where we get these final verses. But my eyes are fixed on you, O sovereign Lord. In you I take refuge. Do not give me over to death. Now, if you're scared of heights and you've ever had the misfortune of being on a roller coaster or perhaps a very dramatic cable car ride, you'll know that the last thing you focus on is the drop. That's terrifying, isn't it? You'll either close your eyes and grip hold of something solid, or you'll focus on something solid and immovable and not look down. And I think that's the sense here. David's aware of his peril, within and without, but he's not going to focus on it. That would be enough to paralyze him with fear. David's focus is on the Lord. So his eyes are fixed on the Lord. Now, some of you will know of Paul White, who was a Christian missionary in Africa in the last century, and he wrote a series of children's books called Jungle Doctor. They were, I guess, spiritual fables. They had a spiritual lesson, each of them. And in one of those stories, he tells the tale of Dick, the naive young antelope, who falls into this cunningly laid trap. And he finds himself in this deep, muddy pit, and he tries to climb out, but the walls are too steep, and he tries to jump, but the mud holds him down, and he struggles frantically, but it's no good. He's caught, and he knows that the next day, at the heat of noon, the hunter will be there to either find meat for his cooking pot or skin to sell in the marketplace. Now, thankfully for Dick, he has a great friend and protector, Timber the elephant. No other animal could have saved him. A few tried and failed. But Timber uses his long elephant's trunk to reach down into the pit. And even then, the antelope is very fearful, and he says, "I'm no good at holding on to things." And Timber the elephant replies, "You don't have to hold on to me. I'll hold on to you. Reach up with your front legs. Trust yourself to me. Don't look down. Don't look back. Keep your eyes on me." And with that, he draws this frightened antelope out of the miry clay, and he sets his feet on solid ground. Now, it's a beautiful picture of salvation when the sinner first trusts in Jesus and is set free from slavery to sin. But, I think it's also a recurring picture of what the saved sinner carries on doing in every fresh trial. And it's what David does here. Because there are many sin traps for us. And some are so cunningly laid that we don't see them until it's too late. But David is not depending on himself. He's depending wholly, solely on the Lord. He leans on the sufficiency and the power of God and trusts himself to the Lord. And he says, "Keep me from the snares they've laid for me, from the traps set by evildoers. Let the wicked fall into their own nets while I pass by in safety." Now, David's praying for something that I think is a reality. He's speaking of the inbuilt futility of sin and rebellion. If you've ever thrown a boomerang, you'll know that because it's got a curved shape, it comes back to you, doesn't it? And Numbers says, Numbers 32, "Be sure your sin will catch you out." And sin does. Sin invariably does come back on people and catches them out. It's part of God's holy judgment, and it's also, I think, the law of consequences built into our world, that a sinful man or woman sow what they reap. And this is what David prays for, that the evil plots of the wicked will come back on them, and that the wicked will suddenly find themselves caught in their own snares. And I think it is something to reassure ourselves of, isn't it? The wicked, I don't really know what to call them. Perhaps I'll just call them the people of influence in our society. They have well-laid plans. They've captured the government, they've captured the law courts, they've captured the media, they've infiltrated the schools, they've infiltrated the universities, and their anti-God worldview prevails in our country, and it has done for some time. They have won. And yet, people like that are wicked. And the Bible often describes wicked people as arrogant. It makes them overconfident. It means they overreach. We can see it in history, can't we? How many wicked tyrants have been overthrown? How many evil empires have in the end collapsed? History attests it. And we can be confident, like David, that in the end, the godless and wicked people who rule the roost in our society right now, and their values are what drives society, they will be arrogant and they will overreach. And in the end, their evil will come back upon them. And if not in this life, then certainly in eternity. Whereas David, in the meantime, this man in a tight spot, he's God's man in a tight spot. And David believes and prays that he will survive. "Let the wicked fall into their own nets while I pass by in safety." Now, I don't think we should think that David is concerned primarily with saving his own skin. He's not. Of course he doesn't want to be given over to death. Who would? But there is something worse than death. David is concerned with the honour of the Lord and that he might dishonour the Lord and fall from grace forever. That's his main concern, I think. And this is therefore a bold but simple prayer that whatever the trap, he will pass by in safety. He won't get stuck in the snare. He will just pass it by while the wicked fall into their own trap. He's praying that his faith will survive and that whatever happens, he will remain in the loving arms of his Lord. It's such a simple request, isn't it? While I pass by in safety. But it's the simplicity of faith. David has absolutely zero ability to engineer his own survival, and he knows he doesn't deserve to survive. He knows his sinful heart. And yet he prays simply and boldly that he will pass by in safety. Because you see, when your focus is wholly and solely upon the Lord, it really is that simple. David knew the grace of the Lord upon his life. He could attest to it. He'd already been through many trials. He'd fought bears and lions. He'd fought a 9-foot-plus giant, and he'd come through. And it wasn't a coincidence. It was the Lord's work. David knew that the Lord who was sovereign was also good and kind, the covenant God, the faithful God, who does come quickly when he's called. Not because he has to, not because he's our slave, but because he loves to. It's who he is. Nothing too hard for that kind of a God. And so David prays with full assurance and in faith. And I think the lesson for us is that if that same Lord, David's God, is our focus, then we can be confident too. I mean, if the Lord didn't spare his own son, but gave up Jesus for us all, well, how much more will he not give us all things? Now, it doesn't mean that we're never going to suffer. It doesn't mean even that you will never die. But if you are focused on the Lord, you can know, absolutely know for sure that you will be kept from falling. That whether it's your own evil heart or the wickedness of the world around you, no snare will keep you. That you won't ultimately deny the Lord. That you won't slide to hell. Because he's got you. He's holding on to you. He's keeping you by his mighty hand. Which is an extraordinary thing to say when we think about the enemies that we have to face. The world, the flesh, and Satan dwell around the paths I tread. And that's a formidable trio, an axis of evil, isn't it? And yet we have a greater than they. We have the Lord God. And I pray that our Christian lives will be like this psalm. From the beginning right through to the end, all about the Lord. About us looking upwards, recognizing our need in humility, crying out to the Lord, not sort of testing our own solutions first. Looking upwards, crying to him, trusting in him, believing his promises in his word, resting in him, depending on him. And we can be sure, as David was, that in doing this, we will pass by those snares in safety. He will keep us safe. May the Lord help us to trust him today and every day. Amen.